Welcome back to Bazaar. I'm Inko, and I'm alive. For those who are wondering where I've been, there's a community post about it. I'll have a channel update coming in the relatively near future. Don't want to bog down the intro with it. Let's get right into the new stuff for Mac. His new set's been fully revealed, and gotta be honest, I'm not super optimistic about the cards coming out in this set. I think the new cards inhabit a pretty interesting design space, and it's entirely possible with new cards that are this alien to the old stuff. I'm just failing to evaluate them, but I'm really not seeing it. Let's go through the cards and talk about what they do, and I'm going to lead with what I view as the three weakest cards in his set by far. Fungal Spores is a 4-speed small item, and your poison items gain 2 poison for the fight every time it goes off. So essentially, it is a non-passive emerald that very quickly outscales an emerald. Now, don't get me wrong, this is rock solid in the early game, because poison is just generally strong for like days 1 through 4, and this is enough poison scaling to meaningfully help out those builds. However, outside of its early game niche, Fungal Spores probably doesn't exist, just like Emerald basically doesn't exist after the first couple of days. Don't get me wrong, it's a fine card, early game power spike cards deserve to exist, but this is not a particularly compelling card, and it's not looking to really change the late game for Mac in any meaningful way. It just makes poison builds a little bit stronger in the early game. Moving on to Mac's, in my opinion, most interesting card in the set, but also I think one of the weaker cards in the set, Peace Rot. It's a medium property, 7-second speed, gain 2 regeneration for the fight, and then the passive effect, when you visit a merchant, permanently destroy the weapon to the left of this to increase this item's regeneration by its value. There's a tiny bit of pronoun confusion there where it's not clear if Peace Rot's value or the weapon's value is what matters. I assume it's the weapon's value. Don't get me wrong, Peace Rot can scale up to monstrous values. I absolutely want to try to play with this and get it to scale and have some ludicrous amount of regen on it by the end of the game. But the reality is this thing takes 7 seconds to go off. It's going to need to do outrageous amounts of regen to actually win fights. And generally speaking, if your plan is to be passive and defensive and let your opponent scale up, you're going to get one shot eventually, whether it's by thousands of burn, tens of thousands of poison, or just a big bonk and stick, right? This is also like your whole game plan if you're going into it, because this is the most negative economy item in the entire game, because you don't get the gold from the destroyed weapon or any sort of refund from this. So yeah, theoretically, you can hit 4 merchants a day and boost this thing's regen value by absolutely massive amounts, but getting the gold to do that seems incredibly hard to do. Even if you found multiple high-tier lead generators and the ways to transmute them, when you add Peace Rod and a bunch of weapons to your stash, suddenly you can barely afford any space to even pick up monster loot with, right? I can't really imagine a situation where this is the best game plan I can go for, and I kind of need to have the best possible economy Mac can hit to even consider going for something like this. It's just such an incredibly brutal cost to not get any of the value from the items you're destroying, because the way Mac's economy works, even though it's very strong, is that it takes up a ton of stash space. So picking up a bunch of weapons to sell at all, well, quote unquote, sell at all the merchants is going to be really hard to do while actually having the income to scale this thing up. And then, again, regen's just not a really solid late game plan, because when you have like 3,000 burn or your opponent scaling a femur or whatever, you're just not going to be able to out-regen that. Especially when the regen source is every 7 seconds, it's just not even very fast either. And while I think Fungal Spores and Peace Rot aren't great, the rest of this all sort of fits together into the new self-poison archetype, and I'm going to start with what I view as by far the weakest card in that archetype, the Wild Quillback. It is a medium passive friend. It doesn't have an activation time at all. And it is a symmetrical effect. When a player uses a weapon, poison that player 3. So you or your opponent. Additionally, when a player uses a non-weapon item, that player gains 3 regen for the fight. And honestly, this just doesn't stand out to me as a particularly powerful effect. When a player uses a weapon, poison that player 3 is not exactly weapon counterattack, the value is too low. In terms of enabling self-poison for yourself, with the cards we're about to talk about, there seem to be many better ways to do this than Wild Quillback. In terms of regen stacking, like that's the one niche Quillback has, is this could be a very powerful piece in an early game poison board that happened to be running a Nightshade, where suddenly all of your non-weapon items are now giving regen from the Quillback, and that's scaling up the Nightshade. But Nightshade's, again, a relatively early to mid-game plan. You don't want to ever try to go 10 wins on Nightshade. So Wild Quillback, while it does enable that to a better degree, kind of not really a late game thing. I think this has a small, meaningful home with that sort of Nightshade archetype, but I don't really see it doing enough outside of that in the early game. And with these last 7 cards, we're well and truly into the self-poisoning archetype, So I'd like to start with what I view as the most meaningful card in that archetype by far, the Adrenal Converter. It's a medium apparel, takes 6 seconds to cast, and it poisons both players 5. Then it has the passive effect: when you poison yourself, gain a 10 regen for the fight, and haste 1 item for 2 seconds. Now the way poison and regen works if you have both, is it just does the net effect. It's not like you take 5 and then heal 10 or vice versa. It just does whatever the net effect is. So if you've gained 5 poison and 10 regen, you just heal 5 every second. So just as a baseline, what this card says is poison your opponent 5, gain 5 regen, haste 1 for 2 every 6 seconds, right? Because poison 5, regen 10 is the mechanical same thing as regen 5. Obviously, it gets a lot more complicated than that with stuff like poison scaling, because you can't regen scale in the same way, and this isn't tracking the poison value. But just the baseline effect of this, poison 5, regen 5, haste 1 every 6, that's the sort of thing where like a single silver item just wins the fight sometimes on days 2 through 4. You've encountered no shortage of games, I imagine, where your opponent's a Vanessa, they have a silver life preserver, and you just lose to 1 silver medium item. I think Adrenal Converter might be at that power level, where the effect of poison 5, regen 5, unlimited uses, 6-second cast time, haste 1 for 2 is just so much that this card is single-handedly a powerhouse in the early mid game. And then, going into the late game, it has the passive effect for all your other self-poisons of gain 10 regen and haste something. This is going to be hasting a ton of items. Your whole board is built around self-poison. It's going to be generating a ton of regen for defenses to help counteract your self-poison and, in fact, give you a meaningful defensive strategy. This just seems like the most important, most powerful card of the archetype, and I am genuinely very hyped for Adrenal Converter. It's very likely that if you're going to go into self-poison, it's because you found one of these relatively early. Next up, we have the Venomous Dose. It's a 4-second cooldown, poison both players 2, gain regen for the fight equal to this item's poison. So that's just a 4-second cooldown poison 2. And this regen does track the poison value, so it's always going to be essentially canceling out its own self-poison, right? And then when you have other passive effects triggering off your self-poison, like the Adrenal Converter, the Venomous Dose goes from honestly kind of fine in the early and mid game to just genuinely good. I don't really feel like there's a ton to say on Venomous Dose. It just does a small amount of poison pretty quickly and triggers self-poison synergies, and that's probably all it needs to do for a small item. It seems like it's good enough if you're in the archetype. It's playable if you're not in it and you're just looking to fill your board in the early game, as all poison items are. And I think this is probably fine. I'm not hyped about it. I'm not disappointed in it. It is exactly what it needs to be, no more, no less. Which brings us to Rapid Injection System, which is a passive medium item meant to scale all your other self-poison things. It says, when you poison yourself, poison 4, so suddenly anytime you're self-poisoning, you're also poisoning your enemy by more than you used to, because most of these self-poison effects are poison both players. And then when you use an adjacent item, poison yourself 4 and gain 2 regen. And again, because you're poisoning yourself, you also poison your enemy 4. So now any 2 fast items can become self-poison triggering items, or already self-poisoning items can do it a second time. And then there's some regen scaling, not enough to counteract the poison again, but enough to meaningfully slow it down. And again, the net effect is hugely positive. Poison your opponent 4, poison yourself 2. That's not insane, but put it next to any 2 fast items, such as Shard of Obsidian or the new Barbed Claws we're about to talk about, and that's just probably a good source of poison, probably a good enough strategy in the early game, and I can see this fitting into late game boards. Personally, I don't think it'll make it much past day 10 or 11, because generally, you don't want to give up 2 board slots for a passive effect that's not doing an absolute ton, and frankly, I'm not sure this is doing enough. All of this we don't know the scaling for yet. I don't imagine this is going to scale enough to really make it feel worth the increased vulnerability to disruption effects. I guess that's what you would describe passive items as being. I'm not thrilled about Rapid Injection System. It seems like a fine part of the build. It allows you to convert other items that are not useful to the build into meaningful self-poison items when you're first assembling it. So it's good in some respects, but it doesn't feel like a piece you're looking to keep forever. Maybe I'm just misevaluating it though. The whole thing is so new that I really can't envision how it meshes with all the old cards just yet. Next, we have the Barbed Claws. It is a small weapon, 5 speed, deal 5 damage, and it has +1 multicast for each player with poison. If they end up dropping a 4-player commander format in the future, I suppose this gets a lot better. But until then, you view this as 3 multicast, right? I think this is just obviously fine with a Poppy Field. It's essentially a 2.5 speed weapon, even if you're not self-poisoning. If you are self-poisoning, then the ability to put it next to Rapid Injection System to get it that next bit of poison, and then to very rapidly trigger these adjacency effects. There's definitely a place for Barbed Claws to live in both archetypes. And I really like this item because it bridges Poppy Field and self-poison in a way that makes it easier to pivot between builds, and stuff like this just really needs to exist. I don't know that I think it's going to be particularly strong. It's fine as an avenue for triggering other adjacency effects and self-poison. It's fine as an avenue for triggering Poppy Field repeatedly. And I think that's just good enough. A card doesn't necessarily need to be more than a great enabler for other cards, and that's all Barbed Claws is, but I think it's very good in that niche, and I'm pretty hyped about it. I really strongly expect to see builds that are very powerful featuring Barbed Claws pretty immediately. I have a hard time imagining there's not going to be builds with Poppy Field using this. There's not going to be self-poison builds using this. It's just one of the fastest items in the game, and that's all anything needs to be sick, right? And it combos very nicely with Infused Bracers. It is a medium apparel tool, 5-second cast time, and it poisons both players for 5. And then, as a passive effect, when you poison yourself, your weapons gain plus damage to the fight equal to 1 times the amount poisoned, and an additional passive effect, the weapon to the left has lifesteal. Now, this is a gold tier starting item, which makes it a lot harder to build than it otherwise might be. I don't think you'd ever want to use this with Poppy Field. It's sort of a different way of scaling a similar archetype. You're probably either playing Infused Bracers with a lot of self-poison and specifically Barbed Claws, or you're playing a much wider board with Poppy Field and a ton of weapons. I don't really know that Infused Bracers can ever fit with Poppy Field. It does a similar thing, but you need one or the other, not both. You don't have room for both. That's how it feels. It is definitely very strong, though. You can very obviously put this next to Barbed Claws and just scale all your other weapons to the moon. It creates a way where, as I was saying, I like things that pivot between builds. If you're trying to keep yourself open to Poppy Field and self-poison, this can likely allow a weird hybrid self-poison weapon build to be pretty damn viable up until day 8 or 9, maybe just all the way. Again, I have a really hard time imagining how the self-poison archetype plays. I'm hyped about it, but I don't know that this is that strong. And I think we've talked about probably the best parts of it now. Infused Bracers with Barbed Claws being an insane way to scale weapon damage off of poison. Rapid Injection System undoubtedly being part of that. Venomous Dose and Adrenal Converters being good ways to trigger self-poison. Adrenal Converter in particular, because it's so much defenses and so much haste off of all your other sources of poison. And I like this setup a lot. I don't know how strong it is. It's so hard to evaluate because there just aren't cards like this in the game. I think this is fine-ish. I think it can be something you win with, but it's not something where I look at it and think, oh, this is obviously cracked. I'm willing to eat crow about that. I just cannot really grok it. I cannot wrap my head around it. But there are 2 cards left, and both are pretty cool. Optical Augment is pretty straightforward. It's an entirely passive small tool item. At the start of each fight, poison yourself 4, and the item to the left of this has crit chance equal to your poison. So obviously you can use this if you self-poison enough to give something 100% crit chance, and just not use the strength potion, I guess. And also, if you have this go off at start of fight, it guarantees that something like Barbed Claws will always have the self-poison passive effect, even on the first use, if it is otherwise your first item. Or not even necessarily your first item, just going off before your self-poison effects. I don't know what I think of Optical Augment, because I need to be in the games and play with them and see how adjacency lock feels, but my thought with this is I'm not going to really be able to use this that well. I should self-poison enough that the first volley being guaranteed to trigger self-poison effects is not that important, and this crit chance is really hard to enable because I want Infused Bracers next to it for lifesteal, it being the Barbed Claw, and then Rapid Injection System so it self-poisons, and then there's no room for Optical Augment, and we're about to talk about another adjacency effect, and on the whole, I look at this, and I think it could have been a really cool card, but it's probably competing with other pieces of the archetype that it is strictly inferior to. It's cool, I like the design of it a lot, I'm just not convinced that it's good. And I think that's a really apt summary of our final card, Test Subject Alpha. It's a large weapon friend, 11-second use time, and it deals 50 damage when you activate it. When you use an adjacent item, poison both players 10, and when you poison it, this gains damage for the fight equal to the amount poisoned. And since you are poisoning both players, that adjacency effect is not 10 damage scaling, it's 20 damage scaling. Now, how good Test Subject Alpha is as a late-game win condition really depends on how it scales. If it says when you use an adjacent item, poison both players 10, 20, 30, that's a lot worse than this gains plus damage to the fight equals to 1x, 2x, 3x the amount poisoned, because that would not be scaling the rest of your board in the same way. There's also a counter argument that this doesn't actually deal that much damage, and you want the better poison scaling instead, and maybe you need the Adrenal Converter just to keep you alive through Test Subject Alpha's rampage that poisons the shit out of both of you. Because you can really easily see, right? An Adrenal Converter on one side every 6 seconds, Barbed Claws with 3x multicast on the other side, And suddenly, you're doing a ton of self and opponent poison, and this scales up pretty quickly, it feels like. But I kinda don't think it's enough to matter. 11 seconds is a little bit of an eternity. I don't think this is going to scale up enough to kill somebody on the first shot, and the second shot's probably not happening unless your opponent low-rolled anyway, is kind of how I feel about it. Especially considering how much poison you really should be doing to them if this guy's on your board, right? And I kind of have this little thought stuck in my brain about this card that's making me hate this card, and I think I'm unfairly judging it because of this idea, but like when you use Test Subject Alpha, it deals damage equal to the poison you've done so far, plus 50. You know what else does that damage? Waiting 1 second. Because that's how poison works. Now, admittedly, you'd be dealing a lot of self-poison with Test Subject Alpha, so it is better than that. You'd have to wait 2 seconds. But you get my point, right? If Test Subject Alpha is going to be good, it cannot be good because of this deal 50 damage scale-off poison effect. It actually has to be good off of the passive effect when you use an adjacent item poison both players. Because otherwise, it's basically just minorly accelerating the speed that poison deals damage to your opponent. It's also worth noting that poison builds rarely actually want to have damage. Like, yeah, sure, you can have the crazy obsidian pufferfish sort of thing. But usually, if your poison build deals damage, it tends to just make you vastly worse into a matchup if your opponent has any amount of shield, because suddenly you have to care about their defenses. So the fact this does deal damage doesn't actually do it any favors. I think most games, you can reasonably expect to win and go 10 wins if your build involves triggering an 11-second cast time. Not on like day 14 plus. But before day 14, when people say like, oh, it takes 6 seconds to go off, trash build, that's exaggerating. That's not true. I think you can reasonably expect to be able to go 10 wins in a build where Test Subject Alpha actually goes off and deals damage. I'm just not convinced that even in that build, his damage is substantial. Again, just live for 2 more seconds, right? Like if you replace Test Subject Alpha with a Diamond Memento Mori and an Invulnerability Pot, you probably deal the same damage from poison, unless this passive effect is a huge amount of the poison you're dealing. And that makes it absolutely impossible for me to evaluate him, because I recognize that it scales up damage with Infused Bracers. It gives lifesteal based on the self-poison, effectively, right? Because you're scaling the damage and then lifestealing with it. You have all of these things that can link together with his old cards and the new cards in different ways, and I'm not really sure how it's going to play out. I think he's strong, but genuinely, this is the first set review where I looked at the cards and I was like, I don't get it. I don't know what's going on. I think the new stuff is pretty interesting in general. I will say this, while I'm not convinced it's very strong looking at all of it, I am convinced it's all pretty interesting. Fungal Spores is an early game power item. Peace Rod is a crazy scaling goose chase. I'm worried it's going to turn out to be a goose egg, a big fat zero, but I do think that it is actually a really interesting design, even if it looks like it's economically non-feasible. Quillback's really the only miss design-wise for me. I love Adrenal Converter. Venomous Dose feels a niche that need to be filled. Rapid Injection System's just like a good enough passive way of enabling the build if you haven't found a Test Subject Alpha. Barbed Claws are a wonderful bridge between all of this stuff and Poppy Field. Infused Bracers are basically a Poppy Field alternative for a similar style of build that functions very differently. Optical Augment's definitely fine. It's not a bad item. I can imagine builds where it's used, and just because it's competing with things that feel better with Infused Bracers and Test Subject Alpha and Rapid Injection System, you don't know you're going to find those, right? I've had 10-win runs on Pig where I used a pre-reworked Landscraper, where that was a terrible card. It was just a vastly worse version of Fixer Upper. But being a worse version of a card doesn't mean you're bad. There are plenty of circumstances in the Bazaar, in fact, the majority of runs experience this to some degree or another, where you don't get the best thing. You just get some things and you make do, and I think Optical Augment's great within that card identity. It doesn't need to be part of an ideal board. And Test Subject Alpha is like the hardest for me to evaluate. I really genuinely think this when you poison, scale up this item's damage every 11 seconds, deal damage based on the total poison you've done over the game. Just like, I almost don't even think it matters. The reason this active effect matters is because now it can be frozen. I feel like if this is a good card, it's based on the self-poisoning adjacency bonus, which is a very massive amount of self-poison. But I'm not convinced he's actually strong, and I want him to be strong. This is the most I've ever been conflicted about a card, and again, it just comes down to this thought that's stuck in my brain. You know what you can do to deal your poison damage to somebody? You can wait another second. Why wait 11 seconds to deal it when you can just wait 12 seconds? Every single second of the game, you deal all the poison you've dealt up until then. Does it make you better into Augment? Sure, why not? But in the vast majority of circumstances, I just look at Test Subject Alpha and I'm like, oh, this doesn't actually do very much. I will say that it allows your poison build to beat an infinite scaling regen build because you'll clock them for a ton of damage 33 seconds in. Even if they're out regenning your poison, you might still be able to one-shot them. I just have such a hard time evaluating this because it's so heavily rooted in how valuable this is. And like, I can build Disneyland scenarios in my head. I'm not going to waste my time and waste your time talking about them, how it can obviously combat with the other stuff we've shown so far. But at the end of the day, in the actual experience run to run, when you're not getting perfect combinations, just putting him next to other stuff, is he good enough? I don't know. He's 11 seconds and poisoning the shit out of you. You're probably not going to make it to 22 seconds unless you specifically hit the Adrenal converter to keep yourself alive for that long, right? Not necessarily. You could use Infused bracers to give him lifesteal. That would help. Final words. I like the max set. I don't think it's incredible. I do think it's well designed and interesting, and I'm sure that with buffs and tuning, it can go from like not actually incredible to something worth seriously considering every run. And I'm not even sure it's as weak as it feels to me. I do definitely think you can go 10 wins with it, but there are a lot of pieces where I look at them and question their value, especially individually. I'm not convinced by it yet. I'm not sure it's bad. I just don't think it's top tier, and I'm not even convinced it's like second tier. It's definitely very interesting and so different that no amount of looking at it will give me a correct assessment of the cards. I feel like I'm starting to go in circles, so let's wrap it up. Thank you for your time. If you made it this far, I'd really appreciate it if you could drop a like and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow, and I really do appreciate it. And I'll see you in the next one. Peace.